What's up YouTube, PokePrimer here, ready to deliver you our Week 4 recap of the IPBL here on the channel. This was a very interesting week. A lot of really interesting matches went down, some very important matches as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and we're going to get into the action, starting off with our match, the Pittsburgh Poplios taking on the Massachusetts Charizards. Massachusetts Charizard this week, coached by Josh, were taking over by Ronnie. Ronnie was generous enough to help Josh out because he was very busy. So Ronnie decided to bring the Mega Tyranitar, Excadrill, Delphox, Skuntank, Florges, and Milotic, Mega Banette, Zapdos, Amoonguss, Sneasel, Regirock, and Volcanion were my picks for this week. A couple things to note before I get into the actual match itself. The lineup itself was pretty much mostly predicted. The Mega T-Tar Excadrill Sand offensive core was pretty much guaranteed. With that, also knowing the fact that Dragonite would not come if both of those were to come was good to note. The Mamoswine was on my list of potential mons, but at the same time it wasn't exactly something I could see coming. Milotic was a guarantee. Florges was almost a guarantee. Bring, because of the walling potential of both of them. Electros was on my list as a really high potential bring, but he did not bring it. That was one of the ones I expected the most. Delphox I didn't really expect coming, but I'm not too surprised because of its speed. He needed the speed on his team. As for the Skuntank, he needed hazard removal. That's pretty much the only reason I could think of bringing it. So he did in fact bring it. So there it is. But get into the actual match itself. He actually ran Sub Life Orb Skuntank, which is a very interesting set. Bit strange because you're giving up a lot of HP. But he ran Sub Life Orb Skuntank, which was actually able to beat the lead matchup of Skuntank versus Sneasel, where it was able to sub turn 1 after living an Icicle Crash with above 25%, and then able to freely go for a Flamethrower and kill off the Sneasel. But at that point, it died to its own Life Orb because it lost so much HP between the Icicle Crash, the sub, and the Life Orb. It lost so much HP that it just died. So it didn't really get to do too much, but at least it was able to take out the Sneasel and prevent the potential of a 6-0, which is really good for him on his part. So, after that, it was pretty much one-sided. It was a matter of there was a lot of switches that went around. Florges was on the field, and it was clearly a threat to whatever was out on the field. I believe it was Zapdos, and instead of going into the Amoonguss like typically would, I decided to go into the Regirock to scout for the Psychic on the Florges, which was in fact carrying the Psychic. So that was a very interesting play, just to make sure that Florges couldn't really hurt Amoonguss too much. I wanted to just make sure and see if it had it and calc it and try to figure out what kind of set he was running. So that was really interesting there. Amoonguss was able to block an incoming Toxic, I believe, from the Milotic, and at that point was able to fire off a free Spore onto whatever wanted to come into the match. I do believe it ended up being the Delphox. Delphox came into the match, and after a foul play, I do believe that it was Regirock who ended up picking up the kill, as Amoonguss was then switched into Regirock. Regirock took a Flamethrower very easily and was able to Stone Edge the Delphox. Very interesting series of plays. Just kind of whittling the Delphox down into guaranteed range of being KO'd from just about anything. So that was good. For the first time this season, offensive Mega Banette was brought by the Poplios. Mega Banette meant more to do damage than to be utility and bulky and supportive, which was brought in all the previous weeks. Weeks 1 through 3, Mega Banette was brought either physically bulky or especially bulky, depending on the matchup. This week, Mega Banette was brought max attack adamant and allowed for Gunk Shot to absolutely obliterate the Florges. Regirock ended up in a scenario against Mega T-Tar, where it was able to, with its bulk, with its natural defensive bulk, with no defensive investment, was able to actually whittle down the Mega T-Tar down to a very viable range, living at several EQs, and then was able to switch into the Zapdos, predicting another EQ, and allow for Zapdos' U-turn to pick it off. U-turn was run over Volt Switch due to the fact of the Charizards having 2 different ground types on the team, so there would be no reason to run Volt Switch, as that's just a big risk of having something like Mammothwine or Excadrill, which, if scarfed or offensive spreads, could easily outspeed and beat the Zapdos. So the U-turn was used effectively in this case to pick up Zapdos' first of 3 kills in the matchup, which is very interesting to note. After all of that, after the Florges went down, it was very easy to bring Zapdos in on the Milotic and clean up the Excadrill and Milotic with a combination of Thunderbolt and Heat Wave to allow the Poplios to pick up a 5-0 victory over the Massachusetts Charizards. Big wins like this are huge, as we're getting later in the season, and divisional matches like this are becoming more and more important, so that you can come out on top in the league itself, come out on top in the division, and get those top spots. So that's really, really important stuff. The Poplios really came out on top this week in order to head towards that top spot. So with that, that's going to conclude this matchup, 5-0 victory for the Poplios. The next match is Justin and the Tony Typhlosions taking on Ronnie and the Detroit Drampas. Ronnie decided to bring his Mega Latias, the Tangrowth, the Entei, Umbreon, Cresselia, and Archeops, while the Tony Typhlosions decided to bring their Mega Scizor, Electivire, Hitmonlee, Rhydon, Togetic, and Jirachi. The Tony Typhlosions were able to pick up a 3-0 victory over the Detroit Drampas in a very, very hard-fought matchup. Very, very hard-fought. A couple things to note. Togetic was actually able to eat up an Acrobatics from an Archeops, which I'm really interested to know. I'll have to rewatch the battle again to see what the situation was. But you can watch it. I'll leave the link to the battle in the comment section below. Or not in the comment section, in the description. So you can check that out. But I'm really curious as to why the Archeops Acrobatics'd the Togetic. Not sure if it had Rock-type coverage or not. But I'm not sure why it would go for the Acrobatics on the Togetic instead of going for a Stone Edge or something, which would have done a tremendous amount of damage. But Togetic swallowed the Acrobatics from the Archeops and was able to then T-Wave it and pretty much neutralize Archeops at that point, because Archeops without its speed is essentially useless, especially if you can whittle it down to its defeatist. So Archeops is a good mon, don't get me wrong, it's just a matter of keeping it above that 50% health and keeping it fast so it can do what it needs to do. Jirachi, just picking up the flinch on the Mega Latias was kind of just like a revenge, it felt, as Jirachi was formerly owned by the Drampas, and Jirachi provided no form of real hacks for them while a member of the team, and in this case it hacks against him, so I feel like it's kind of like a revenge from Jirachi for Ronnie dropping him before he could really get going in the season. I just thought this was a really, really interesting point to note that Jirachi was picking up hacks against him as it was able to take on the Mega Lottie. Archeops was absolutely murdered later in the match by Rhydon. Rhydon was able to pick it off very, very easily. A Mega Horn miss and foul play crit allowed the Umbreon to beat Rhydon, which not before the rocks went up, though. Rocks going up was huge in this match, as at that point he didn't have hazard removal, as Mega Lottie was already gone, and Entei could really get whittled down. However, I do believe that this mattered a lot. I'm not 100% sure of Ronnie's spreads, but I do believe, and I will run this calc right now, you're going to see that the animations have stopped, but I do want to run this calc right now. I'm not sure of their spreads, but if we're going to say maybe a Jolly Rhydon versus an Umbreon, okay? Jolly Rhydon versus an Umbreon, we're going to give this Rhydon Mega Horn. Mega Horn. So if it's a standard specially defensive Umbreon versus a Jolly Rhydon, the Mega Horn would have done 60 to 72%. So in that case, it would have really helped to whittle down the Umbreon. And I do also believe that the Rhydon outsped the Umbreon, so it would have been able to take it out on the following turn. Regardless of anything, if we were able to hit another Mega Horn or something along those lines, or even just a Stone Edge, because a Stone Edge does a minimum of 38%. It could have beaten the Umbreon 1v1 if it had not come down to that Mega Horn missing and then the foul play critting it, because foul play did about 25 to 30% regularly, so with the crit, it was able to do more than enough damage to finish off the Rhydon, which is really unfortunate for Justin. It would have been really cool to see the Rhydon beat Umbreon, but you know, what can you do about that? So, you know, yeah, sorry about that as well, the graphical glitch there, but we are still moving onward here. Mega Scizzor's Bug Bite. Mega Scizzor was actually able to pick up a kill against, I believe it was the Umbreon? I believe it was the Umbreon. Either the Umbreon or the Cresselia, I don't remember off the top of my head. I do believe it was the Umbreon. Bug Bite was able to crit the Umbreon, which I do believe, after running several calcs, that the crit actually mattered. Based upon the amount of HP that the Umbreon was at, the crit mattered in killing it. 100% mattered. Umbreon could have lived and foul played and done a decent chunk of damage, or some other move to whittle down the Mega Scizzor. So that's very interesting. Very interesting situation, but it was also very interesting to see that the Mega Scizzor was allowed to die. Justin then allowed Mega Scizzor to go down against, I believe it was the Entei. He allowed Entei to just kill it, while there was still a Tangrowth and a Cresselia sitting in the back, as Bug Bite is super effective on both of them and could have done a lot of damage later on in the match. So very questionable decision, but I do believe it did work out in the long run. Cress got paralyzed and flinched a lot, which allowed Hitmonlee and Togetic to both survive past it. There were occasions where the Cresselia could have killed both Mons, but based upon either full paras or it was either a full para or a flinch on that turn that caused the Cresselia to not be able to move, pretty much. And then after 3 flinches in a row, Jirachi was able to kill off the Cresselia. After it had already set up to +5, which at that point, I can't take anything away from Justin because he played very well for the most part in this matchup. But Ronnie set himself up essentially to win by setting up with Cress. He was in a really good position, and it just didn't pan out because Jirachi just haxed him so hard back. And then at that point, it was a matter of just beating the Tangrowth, and Hitmonlee was packing the Blaze Kick. So Blaze Kick from the Hitmonlee was able to take out the Tangrowth and give the Tony Typhlosions their 3-0 victory, keeping them atop the division as well, which is really, really cool. So congratulations to Justin. Very, very good, well-played game on him. Good stuff. As we move on to our next game, which is the Charlotte Salandits versus the Carolina Cutie Flies. And this match had huge divisional ramifications, as if the Salandits had lost, they would have bounced down to second place. If the Salandits won, they would have stayed in first. And the Salandits did, in fact, win 2-0 against the Carolina Cutie Flies. Chris and the Salandits brought the Suicune, Raikou, Scizor, Mega Sableye, Mandibuzz, and Infernape, while the Carolina Cutie Flies brought the Blissey, Gastrodon, Rotomosh, Haxorus, Victini, and Diancie. I actually helped Jen plan for this matchup. She was very, very terrified of Chris, as he's a very, very difficult opponent, and being the #1 in the league at the current time, I offered to assist her. So there's a lot of interesting things about this matchup. Dual Screens Rotom was there as a way of potentially allowing things like Haxorus to set up, which would have been a very, very interesting situation. Gastrodon was actually brought as a way of beating the Credilli. He didn't bring Credilli, which is very, very surprising, as Gastrodon could hard wall things like the Suicune if they weren't packing HP Grass and stuff like that. So very, very interesting on Chris's part. Haxorus was a Dragon Dance setup Haxorus with Outrage and Earthquake, I believe. It was either Outrage and Earthquake or Outrage and some other move. I don't remember off the top of my head what the last move was. But it also had Taunt on it as a way of stopping the Mega Sableye and setting up in front of it, which is very, very interesting. A Sub Victini, which Sub Teeny is very, very useful against his team. It didn't work out in the match, as you can tell, but in theory, Sub Victini after Rocks beats his entire draft. So it would have been interesting to see. Diancie was essentially a Suicide Rocks lead, so that was really interesting to see as well. And Blissey was a Chople Berry counter set to counter, potential superpower on the Scizor, a close combat from Infernape, something along those lines. So getting into the actual match itself, as I get to my notes, because I'm stupid and didn't decide to open to that page immediately. Blissey was able to. No, I'm skipping way far ahead. Scizor knocked off the Babiri Berry on Diancie right at the beginning of the game, which was a very, very brilliant play, because he predicted the Babiri on Diancie. She has brought Babiri Berry Diancie before, so that would have been something he would have thought about. So he knocked off the Diancie ahead of time. I don't know if he knocked it off trying to get rid of the Babiri, or if he knocked it off trying to predict a switch. But either way, he did knock off the Babiri turn 1, which allowed the Scizor to immediately KO the Diancie the following turn with a Bullet Punch. So very, very interesting, very, very well played couple of turns for Chris right at the start of the battle, even though the Diancie was meant to be more so of a suicide. Suicune ended up having a decent amount of speed investment, as it was able to outspeed the Victini set. Now, I don't remember the exact speed EVs that we gave the Victini offhand. You can watch Jen's video, her team builder, for it to determine the speed. But Suicune actually was able to outspeed her Victini, which requires a decent amount of speed investment, I do believe, off the top of my head, because Suicune, with no speed investment, caps out at I believe, it is base 85, if I'm correct. Base 85, something like that. Caps out at, I believe, either 196 or I believe it caps out at like 206. I believe it caps out at 206. And so at that point, he was able to definitely outspeed. It was above min speed on the Victini, so he must have had a really large amount of speed investment in order to outspeed. So it was very, very interesting to note, because having it outspeed essentially murders the strategy that the Victini was using to beat it, because after rocks, Bolt Strike guaranteed 2 KOs. Expert Belt, Max Attack, Naughty Nature, Victini, 2 KOs, a Suicune 100% of the time after rocks, if it's fully physically defensive. And it turned out that with the speed investment, Suicune was 1,000 times more of a threat. Because at that point it could outspeed, break the sub on the first turn, and then proceed to KO the Victini with a Scald on the following turn. So it's a really, really good prep on the Salandit's part, putting speed investment in their Suicune, which is really, really interesting in my eyes. I've never seen that really done before too often, so I'm really, really impressed by that. So the Suicune speed investment essentially counters the Victini strategy. Offensive Mandibuzz was beaten 1v1 by Rotom Wash. Rotom Wash was able to whittle down the Mandibuzz very, very effectively. So that was really, really interesting. It was an interesting turn of events because Mandibuzz could have been used later on in the matchup very effectively. So I'm interested to see why he allowed it to go down to the Rotom, but that's just my thing. Hackthirst was able to get behind screens and set up and beat Mega Sableye, but Mega Sableye did do a large chunk of damage to the Hackthirst before going down, so it's very, very unfortunate on that situation. But yeah, the Scizor was able to come in and pick it off immediately after, but Chople Berry countered Blissey, was able to beat the Scizor. Scizor did go for the superpower against the Blissey, and the Chople Berry popped. Blissey lived very well and was able to counter it. So a very, very interesting situation there, as Infernape was able to come in and pick off the Blissey. My thing is, Gastro was able to Scout Grass Knot on Infernape and then was able to beat it shortly thereafter, so it did have the Protect. It did have the Protect on it to scout for HP grasses, for Grass Knots, stuff like that. So she did go ahead and go for that Protect against the Infernape to see what it was doing, but it was just spamming close combat, so she was able to freely go for an Earth Power and take it out. Now, here's my recommendation towards Jen, and I hope she does watch this. I do hope she watches this. She does typically watch these, but I do hope she watches it. When you're in the late game and you're a bit behind, like on the situation where she was, Victini was against the Suicune. Suicune was in range for the Victini to take it out with a Bolt Strike, and it was a matter of, does she risk the Bolt Strike and go for the kill, or does she go ahead and switch out? Which she did decide to switch out into her Blissey. Now, while I typically don't normally disagree with plays like this, if the Victini had gone for a Bolt Strike and the Suicune did not Scald, she had the game. She essentially had the game, because there's nothing that a Raikou can do to a Blissey to beat it 1v1. Absolutely nothing. Raikou cannot beat Blissey 1v1. And Blissey would be able to Seismic Toss the Raikou down and win the game. However, she decided to switch into the Blissey, and a crit burn from the Scald from the Suicune essentially sealed the game. Suicune was able to then essentially set up a little bit in front of the Blissey and decided that it wanted to then just kill it off and beat the Victini 1v1 with the speed investment. And that allowed these Charlotte Salandits to pick up a 2-0 victory. So, moral of the story is, if you're in the late game, you take the risks. You take the risks. If you think there's any chance of you winning by clicking a certain move, go for it. If you're on the back foot, risk something. The risks are definitely can bring you severe rewards. But regardless of that, Chris remains undefeated. as we move on to the final match of the week, which is a very interesting situation, as we have the Alabama Arcanines taking on the Hereford Gudras, and this match has actually been postponed, and there's a reason for that. Just their schedules, between Juwan's work schedule and Jacob being away at a camp and whatnot throughout the entire week, both of them just could not find a time to get together and have their match. So we decided, those who were in charge decided, that we would postpone the matchup until the week after the final week of action, as we can take a week off heading into playoffs, and these two can have their match during that time period, just so that we have everything in the record books. So you will see this match, you will see this updated. I'm actually going to save the Week 7 recap for slightly after, right before the playoffs, so that we can scope out and see what's going down with that, and we can recap this match when that time comes. But with that being said, we're going to move on now to the MVP rankings, and it's looking very, very interesting. Number 1 in the MVP rankings, we have Suicune from the Charlotte Salandits. 7 kills, 0 deaths. This Suicune has not died once this entire season, with a +7 differential from the Charlotte Salandits. Following close behind is his Charlotte brother, Infernape. 7 kills, 2 deaths, a +5 differential. The Mega Metagross, which was not brought this week by the Carolina Cutie Flies, sits at 3rd place, tied with the Infernape with 7 kills, 2 deaths, and a +5 differential. The Carolina Cutie Flies also have Haxorus in 4th place with 6 kills, 1 death, and a +5 differential. For Relegated from the Tony Typhlosions after its Dragon Dance sweep in Week 3, I believe, it still sits here in 5th place with 5 kills, 0 deaths, +5 differential. Manaphy, which was formerly owned by the Toronto Tyrantrums, I have to edit that a little bit later on. I will edit that for next week's recap. Manaphy, 5 kills and 2 deaths, +3 differential. Slurpuff sits still at in the nice, pretty 7th place with 4 kills, 0 deaths, and +4 differential from the Pittsburgh Poplios. The following two are also Poplios members, Zapdos being 4 and 1 with a +3 differential, and Volcanion being 4 and 2 with a +2 differential, as Entei is also here from the Detroit Drampas, sitting at 4 kills, 3 deaths, and a +1 differential. So the MVP rankings are looking very interesting. Obviously, Mons like the Mega Metagross, Infernape, Haxorus are very commonly seen in the tops of these countdowns, because they are typically more offensive Mons. But having a Mon like Suicune in the number 1 slot is very, very interesting, because it is typically more of a defensive threat than anything. So having that there is very, very cool, and a true testament to Chris and the Charlotte Salandits for their ability to use Infernape properly. So with that, seeing the top of the leaderboards, we're going to go to the very bottom of the leaderboard and see who the league losers are. And the league losers as of this time are Florges. Florges is the only loser right now. It is currently sitting at 0 and 3. Every time it's come, it just dies. It doesn't do anything. And this actually provides an interesting thing, because we recently added a little bit of a twist to make the MVP rankings worthwhile. Basically, whoever is the number 1 in the MVP rankings, such as Suicune right now, the champion of the league, who will be the final pick in the draft, will have the option of franchising whoever the number 1 Pokemon is for their team in the following season. And whatever tier that mon will be, that will just fulfill the slot of their final round pick of that tier. Okay, makes sense, right? However, the mon that is the league loser will be essentially banned from the league the following season. So in this case, if the season were to end right now, Florges would, in fact, go ahead and not be allowed in IPBL Season 2. This is so that no team is forced to carry a Pokemon that can't carry its own weight. And it would just take a season off to essentially train in the mountains and increase its abilities so that the following season it can come back and show off its abilities. So it's a really, really interesting thing, and right now Florges is in severe danger of not making it into IPBL Season 2. So that'd be really, really interesting to see such a defensive fairy-type threat disappear. So it's a very, very interesting idea that I was able to come up with. I really, really do like that that the MVP rankings are getting some form of recognition as the season goes on. So with that, now we move into the league standings, and the league standings are looking very interesting at this point. As in the Kanto division, we have the Charlotte Salandits 4-0, undefeated up to this point, with a plus 14 differential, which is very, very impressive. Very, very impressive indeed for the Charlotte Salandits. Following very closely behind, however, are the Pittsburgh Poplios, who are also undefeated up to this point, with a plus 12 differential after a huge win this week over the Massachusetts Charizards. The Carolina Cutie Flies are in third place, sitting at 2-2 with a plus 4 differential. They're definitely not totally out of the race just yet for the playoffs, as the top two teams are the one in each division are the ones that go on to have their essential hands raised for the playoffs. So as of right now, she's not totally out of the race. She can come back if she continues to win out and one of the top two teams starts to have a string of bad luck or a couple of tough losses. It could completely turn the season around for the Cutie Flies at this point. So very interesting to note. And then the Massachusetts Charizards are currently in last place with a 1-3 record, minus 12 differential. Now, at this point, even if one of the teams in the top two were to lose out the rest of the season, the Massachusetts Charizards mathematically are essentially eliminated from playoff contention. Well, not entirely. I mean, if say the Charlotte Salandits are 6-0'd for the following 3 weeks, their differential would drop by 18, so they'd be a minus 4. And if the Massachusetts Charizards 6-0 all their opponents, they will be at plus 6, so they could be able to potentially do it, but it's mathematically very, very difficult for the Charizards to even have a chance at playoffs. So at this point, they just kind of have to look forward to either A, getting the best record that they can, or B, just kind of swamping it for the rest of the season and taking that #1 draft pick next season. So we'll see what they decide to do from there. And now moving over to the Johto division, we have the Tony Typhlosion sitting at 3-1 with a plus 6 differential in first place, developing quite a decent lead for themselves as we move forward here. The Tony Typhlosions are definitely putting in a lot of work this season. Justin has really, really improved, and he continuously shows improvement as time goes on with his battling, so I definitely look forward to him being a huge threat in the future. Following him behind is the Hereford Gudras, who are 1-2. Because of the postponement, I do have that little asterisk next to their name, so that we know that the record is just withstanding of that one match that is postponed. He sits 1-2 at minus 5. The Alabama Arcanines are sitting at 0-3 with a minus 5 differential as well. Have not been able to get out of the blocks, so we'll see what happens there in the future. The Detroit Trampas are sitting at 0-4 at the very bottom at a minus 14 differential. Yeah, Ronnie just hasn't had any good luck. I mean, between not being able to get any hacks for Jirachi in the early parts of the season to being hacked by Jirachi this week, it's just been a really, really tough season for Ronnie. But you know, there's still 3 weeks remaining. He could potentially win out and still get a playoff spot if the rest of his division continues going the way it has been. So that'd be really, really interesting to see what happens with that. And with that, with knowing the league standings and where everything sits, we move on to next week's matchups. First match of the week is going to be Justin and the Tony Typhlosions taking on Chris in the Charlotte's Land. It's #1 in each division, duking it out in this match. It's a very, very interesting matchup. An even more interesting twist upon this matchup is the fact that Chris will actually not be participating in the battle. Chris has asked me to cover his match this week. So because his girlfriend / fiance or whatever, I'm not 100% positive. I do believe she is his fiance. I believe they are going to get married eventually. They've been together for a long time, to my knowledge. So I do believe that Chris. I don't know if Chris ever proposed to her, but they've been together for a long time. Regardless of that, she's visiting from over the seas this week. So he asked me if I would take over his battle for him. And, of course, I absolutely said yes. So, regardless of the fact that if he loses, I take over the #1 spot in the division, just because of that, regardless of that fact, I'm not going to be petty and just throw the match, because that would just be wrong. I am going to give this match my all, but it's going to be very, very, very difficult, because I am going to have to adjust to using his team against Justin, and Justin has a really, really good matchup this week. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see how this goes as I take over the Salandits against Justin. Speaking of myself, my match this week is actually going to be against Jacob and the Hereford Gudras. He has assured me that he is going to be making his 2 team swaps, so I'm not going to be able to prep until later in the week, but that is perfectly fine. Whenever he makes his swaps, he's going to make his swaps, and that's fine. Because he is a new coach, he does get the ability to swap for free at any point 2 mons from his team out for any 2 free agents out on the market. So keep an eye out for that. It's going to be very interesting to see what he decides to swap out on his team. So it's going to be an interesting matchup, however. Me and Jacob had a very interesting history of battles against each other. Jacob is a really good battler, really, really good battler. So it's definitely going to be a tough matchup, to say the least, and I'm really looking forward to it. The next matchup we have is Jen and the Carolina Cutie Flies taking on Ronnie and the Detroit Drampas. Ronnie's team doesn't have a very good matchup this week, which is really unfortunate and really, really sucks for him. But Jen needs to keep winning in order to potentially have any chance at playoffs at all in the long run. And while Ronnie needs to just pick up a win itself, at this point, Ronnie to pick up wins is more so at desperation. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this match goes, as nobody wants to end the season without a win. So it'll be really interesting to see how this goes. Both teams really need the win. So it'd be interesting to see how they battle out of desperation purposes. As for the last matchup, it is going to be the Massachusetts Charizards, coached by Josh, versus the Alabama Arcanines, coached by Juwan. Now, Juwan has actually a really okay matchup this week against Justin's team. As long as he can work around the sand offensive core, Juwan has a good chance to pick up his first win this week. But Josh has shown in the past that he can play very, very well. And Juwan has yet to pick up a win this season, so it'd be very, very interesting to see how this matchup plays out. Because of the fact that it's hard to bet on Juwan because he doesn't have any wins this season. It's also hard to bet on Josh because he's the bottom of his division currently. So it's a very, very interesting matchup. It's really hard to call who's going to win this one, but it's going to be a good match regardless. And both teams really need the win to either keep themselves in some form of contention for playoffs or better draft picks and whatnot. It's really, really interesting to see just the situation that both teams are in here. So it'd be very interesting to see that match, and I'm really looking forward to it. But with that, guys, that's going to complete our week 4 recap for the IPBL. If you guys have enjoyed, please make sure to leave a like down below and subscribe if you haven't already. I thank you all for watching, and hopefully you IPBL fans will be looking forward to next week's action as much as I am, because this next week is going to be very, very interesting. So without further ado, I am going to get out of here. I'm PokePrimer, signing off.